entirely sure what they were doing in the lab with fruit flies. But at some point, people working with fruit flies in the lab discovered that traits would appear either completely altered or kind of, strangely new out of nowhere. But they were inheritable, very often recessive, but inheritable. Things like changes in the wings, changes in the body coloration, changes in the eye coloration, all sorts of things that were alterations of the genetics. These were mutations. These guys are supposed to be chromosomes. Oh my goodness, Vinny's mutating. Oh, picture of cells dividing in the background. Embarrassing moments at gene parties. Any change in the coding is a mutation. Code's very long, very complicated. You can get a single, what they call a point mutation, a single change in the code anywhere, and that is a mutation. And as I said before, most of the time a mutation doesn't affect the protein that's being coded for. Is that the DNA code produces amino acids in the protein, and it turns out you can mess with that and get the same amino acid you would have gotten a lot of times, or one so similar that it doesn't affect the protein, or one that's in a place, proteins are really big molecules, you can mess with one part over here and the part over here that's doing the job isn't affected. So most tiny mutations, point mutations, have no real effect. Kind of like opening the hood of a car and just randomly reaching in and whacking something with a hammer. Most of the time, that one little is not going to do anything to the car. Now, when there is an effect, you're more likely to have messed something up than to have made the car run better. And maybe you've knocked some, corrosion loose or something, or you've reset a wire that wasn't in tight. But the odds of a mutation producing an improvement is very, very small. But it does happen. It can change the function of a protein. It can improve the function of a protein. Most of the time it's not, but it can. Now also mutations can be big pieces, whole chromosomes, extra or missing. We'll talk about that in the lab. Whole sets of chromosomes that are added. Animals don't do too well with whole extra sets of chromosomes, but plants do. Is the relationship between teosinte, which is the wild ancestor of modern corn, and modern corn, is the teosinte has 2 sets of chromosomes. Modern corn has 8 sets of chromosomes. So along the way, whole sets of chromosomes have been added that people weren't doing that on purpose. They were going, oh, bigger kernels, let's breed these, not realizing that there was a mutation that was giving them that effect. So mutations are a big deal, but they're very rare that they're going to help anything, and they're more likely to hurt something than to help something. Here's one of those deals like sexual selection, where we've got this term that's kind of a holdover from the way people assumed it worked originally, but it's been improved, it's been fine-tuned, so it's going to be confusing for you. Reproduction, make copies of things. We call 2 different things reproduction. Only one of them really is reproduction, and that is asexual reproduction. You go, oh, it's without sex. Well, yeah, that's how they named it originally. But it turns out that's not the important thing here. The important thing is that in asexual reproduction, the offspring that you get all of your DNA codes. So they get a complete set of codes, which is all your potential, all the different things you can make, all the different things you can do are passed on to your offspring. Now, they may not use the same ones that you use. Keep in mind, that's how we make cells in our bodies. All of our cells have the same genes as all the other cells, but some of them are doing brain cell stuff, and some of them are doing muscle cell stuff, and some of them are doing skin cell stuff. So they don't always use the same genes in their repertoire. And that happens like later, where you'll see corals asexually produce little swimmy jellyfish as a way of spreading. And the jellyfish have the same genes as the corals, they're just using different parts of them. The corals are using one set of genes to be corals, and the jellyfish using another set of the same genes to be jellyfish. Now, the advantage to this is you're actually reproducing, you're actually making copies, which is kind of what you're trying to do. That's the upside. The downside is evolution is driven by changing conditions. If conditions change in a way where one of these guys is in trouble, they're all in trouble. They all have the same potentials, they all have the same weaknesses. So this is a really big downside to asexual reproduction. Asexual reproducers have a workaround. It's not part of the definition, but you find it in asexual reproducers because it's the only way that they've been able to survive, and way more of them than are of us. The vast majority of living things on this planet are asexual reproducers. How did they get away with this? Conditions are always changing. Crank out many offspring. This does two things that are beneficial. You spread them out. Very often for asexual reproducers, which are very small, conditions change in a pretty local environment. And you may be spreading your offspring out beyond that environment, so they're not even affected by it. Think about, you pick up a bacterial infection. You have a population of asexual reproducers making you cough. You spread this around the room. You go and get an antibiotic. Antibiotic is poisonous to bacteria. It's poisonous to all of them. They're gone. But the person next to you that you spread it to, maybe they don't go get an antibiotic. Maybe they, just cough for a while. Hopefully it won't kill them. And they're spreading the offspring, the genetic offspring, even further in the world. The other thing, mutations are very rare. Now, they're sort of rare. Bad mutations, more often than good mutations, but good mutations happen occasionally. A mutation that fits you to changes in conditions. Say you've spread the bacteria to the whole room. There's 30 people in the room. Now you've got quadrillions of bacteria. Many have, and they've made copies of their DNA, and some of them have mucked it up. And you have mutations in the room. Most of those are not doing anything. A lot of them are damaging the offspring bacteria. But some of them potentially could make those bacteria not affected by penicillin. The chemistry that penicillin affects has changed in that bacterium enough that that bacterium can survive being exposed to penicillin. We all go to the doctors and get penicillin. One person in the room, one little cluster of bacteria that have the mutation have been reproducing, is that they're not killed by the penicillin. All the bacteria around them are now dead. They become the infection. They still continue to spread. We didn't get rid of them. The people that pick that up, penicillin isn't going to help them. this new population is genetically resistant to penicillin. But it was working those odds. The odds of having a penicillin-resistant bacterium are astronomical. But there's astronomical numbers of bacteria in those situations. So evolution works for them, but you got to crank out the numbers for that. Oops. Sexual reproduction isn't really reproducing because you're mixing stuff up. You're actually producing a different mix of alleles in your offspring. They are a genetic mix of two sources. Notice it doesn't say two parents, right? Pea plants. If Mendel had just wrapped his pea plants up and left them, which he did eventually when he was crossing them with themselves, then the pollen from the flower goes to the egg cells of the flower, they reproduce by themselves. And you go, well, isn't that asexual? No, because they've taken one of each of their ones, they get two sets of chromosomes. You pick one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and make one set that's a mix of the different alleles for a sperm cell. Do the same thing for an egg cell, put them back together. It's a different mix. Say we could do that. We have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 we got from mom, 23 we got from dad. If we could reproduce by ourselves, we could make sperm and eggs. So I'd make a sperm with 23 chromosomes in it. That's a mixture of my mom's and my dad's chromosomes. Make an egg cell, 23 chromosomes with it. That's a different mixture of moms and dads. Put them together, the overall paired mixture is different than I started with. That is one of the advantages of a high chromosome number. There's a lot of different ways to mix those up, even if you're reproducing by yourself. It's better if the source is another individual, they're bringing in a very different mix, but there's an awful lot of living things in this world that can reproduce by themselves. And it's still sexual reproduction. Okay, don't write this down right there. The advantage, lots of variation in your offspring. Remember, variation is a big driver of evolution. Conditions change, it picks and chooses because your population has variations. Some have advantages under the new conditions, some don't. Well, sexual reproduction produces a highly varied population. That's the advantage compared to asexual. Of course, the disadvantage is you can't really make copies. So again, upside of one is the downside of the other. Now, the terminology here is changing. The way I learned it, it seems to be swapping around. And the difference between what they call gender and what they call sex is swapping. But what I learned, and this is so I'm teaching it, because they haven't, this may settle out the way I learned it, it may settle out another way. I learned that genders are in things that reproduce sexually, and the partners have different roles. Each of those roles is called a gender. Now, the genders you're most familiar with are male and female. And we will talk about what makes males males and females females, and it's not what you think when we get to sexually reproducing organisms later. But that isn't the only way to go. Is that in some funguses, the genders are very much a product of the circumstances, and two partners may act very differently in different circumstances. And how many different roles can they play? Slime molds can play up to 36 roles. Only two at a time, because it's only two partners. But the conditions select, okay, which of these different ways of reproducing are we gonna go with? Male and female, by far the most common approach. You see it in plants, you see it in animals, you see it even occasionally in funguses. But it's not the only way to do it. Oh, actually, I'm going to put this way down on the bottom here. This is going to show up a bunch of times. There's a number of living things. Malaria that I talked about is one of them. Ferns are one of them. Corals are one of them. Where if you follow them through a whole lifetime, every time they go through their lifetime, they'll have one stage where they reproduce asexually and one stage where they reproduce sexually. Round and round and round they go. They alternate their sexual and asexual generations. Now there are some things that can go either way depending on circumstances, but they don't do this and that and this and that always in the cycle. So it's only ones that do it back and forth through the cycle that do that. I'm going to throw the reasoning out here. It'll come up again later, so I'm not going to expect you to remember the different pieces, just the definition here. But in malaria are parasites. Parasites very often do this because they are basically dipping into the advantages of both approaches. It's hard to get from host to host, and very often they'll do asexual in one host and sexual in another host. If you're lucky enough to get offspring into a host, make a bunch of copies of them. If you're lucky enough to get the copies into another host, have them recombine their advantages sexually and send that on to the next host which is going to reproduce asexually and sexually. In the case of corals are stuck in one place. Very much difficult for them to spread in the oceans. They reproduce asexually and just cover an area with corals. Lots and lots of genetic copies. Even if different parts of the corals are doing different jobs, they're using the same genes. They produce those little jellyfish. They can spread. They can take this coral and settle it on a newly risen island somewhere else. So one of the forms doesn't move, the sexual form can move. That's another approach. In the case of ferns, as plants moved onto the land a long time ago, is that they had to adapt to a lot of things about being on land. But one of the trickiest things to adapt to is plants in the water produce swimming sperm. That's how they reproduce sexually. Swimming doesn't work so well on land, but it does if you have access to water you can swim through. So a fern, what you see as a fern, is actually an asexual form. It asexually produces spores that go all over the place. When the spores land, they produce a teeny little sexual form that's teeny because it's close to the ground where the water in the rain and the dew accumulates, and the sperm can swim through that water to get to the egg cells. So all of those are different approaches to alternation generations. It'll come up again when we talk about parasites. It'll come up again when we talk about Cnidaria, which is the group the corals are in. It'll come up again when we talk about ferns, which is why I'm not expecting you necessarily to remember those three approaches now. Okay, that's a good place to stop for this one.